Usually when we talk about a medical diagnosis, there's this expectation of extreme precision.
Right, like an exact science.
Exactly. It's almost like engineering, Like
Yeah.
if you fall off a ladder and you break your arm, you go to the ER, they slide you into an x-ray machine, and an hour later, the doctor slaps a scan up on a light board.
Yeah, and there's that jagged, unmistakable white line right across the bone.
Right. The doctor just points to it and says, there it is. That's the problem.
It's entirely binary. I mean, the bone is either broken or it isn't.
And honestly, there is something deeply comforting about that. We crave that kind of visibility.
We really do. We want our pain to be categorized and labeled.
Put into a neat little box with a straightforward step-by-step treatment plan. But then you step out of the physical realm and you step into the world of spiritual and emotional trauma, and suddenly that high-tech x-ray machine is completely useless.
Oh, completely useless. You're trying to diagnose a shattered identity, right? Or a deeply infected wound of rejection.
Yeah, or like a slow-bleeding generational trauma. We just find ourselves staring at a diagnostic landscape that is incredibly murky.
It is the absolute definition of diagnostic muddy waters. When you're dealing with the human soul, the symptoms rarely look like the root cause.
Wow, yeah. Give me an example of that.
Well, anger, for instance, might actually be a symptom of profound fear. Or hyper-independence might be the scar tissue of childhood abandonment.
Right. And the way we traditionally try to handle these complex, invisible wounds within, spiritual communities has, frankly, been struggling to keep up.
It really has. Which brings us to the core of what we are unpacking today.
Yes, and I'm so excited for this. Welcome, by the way, to today's deep dive. We are looking at a stack of source material that completely overhauls how we view spiritual health, community, and purpose.
It really strips away the whole idea of the church as a pristine museum.
Yeah, a museum meant to showcase perfectly put together people, and instead the text redefines the entire operation as a gritty, urgent, high-stakes field hospital.
It's a completely different paradigm.
So if you are listening to this right now, whether you're currently nursing your own spiritual bruises, or you're someone who is, desperate to understand how to actually help the hurting people in your life without doing more damage, this is for you.
Absolutely. This is about becoming what you could call a spiritual doctor without borders.
I love that phrase, spiritual doctor without borders. So the visual of a field hospital is the perfect anchor for this, right?
It is, and it actually stems from a very specific ancient paradigm. The foundational concept here goes all the way back to the biblical book of Amos, chapter 9.
Okay.
There's a prophetic promise there about God restoring David's fallen tent.
Okay, let's pause right there because David's tent, I think a lot of people might skim past that, assuming it just means a temple or a building or something.
Sure.
But there is a massive distinction between a tent and a temple, isn't there?
An enormous distinction. I mean, historically, King Solomon built a magnificent permanent temple.
Right, it's a famous one.
Exactly. It was made of stone and cedar and gold. It was institutional, heavily guarded, and highly restrictive.
Like only certain people could go into certain areas.
Right, and the presence of God was hidden away behind thick veils. But before that temple existed, King David set up a tent in Jerusalem to house the Ark of the Covenant.
A tent, just like a temporary fabric structure.
Yeah, it was mobile, it was accessible, you could hear the music and the prayers from the street.
So a temple is exclusive and static, but a tent is vulnerable. It's approachable. It's right in the middle of the noise.
Exactly. David's tent represents intimate encounter, immediate access, and healing that isn't gate-kept by religious bureaucracy.
Wow.
It wasn't about a grand, immovable institution. It was about bringing the presence of God directly into the messy reality of daily life.
And that ancient concept of the tent connects directly to a modern reality in our sources today. Think about where we see tents deployed today in high-stakes situations.
Right, on battlefields, disaster zones.
Precisely. And there is this incredibly vivid vision detailed in our source material from 2019. It describes an expansive army of tents erected directly on active battlefields.
But when you look closer at these tents, they aren't military command posts plotting the next attack.
No, they're makeshift hospitals. They're triage centers operating right in the dust, the smoke, and the chaos.
And the reason they are set up right there in the line of fire is because the traditional places of refuge have failed.
Yeah, people are out there getting spiritually maimed.
They really are. They're being damaged by arrogance, by hyper-legalism, by toxic religious structures that, demand perfection before participation.
It's like they're dying of spiritual thirst while being handed dirty water.
That's exactly it. And to really grasp the gravity of this, we have to look at the historical reality of ancient field hospitals. Think of the Roman veletudinariums or commandeered Greek temples during massive ancient conflicts.
Right, we aren't talking about sterile environments with fluorescent lights and soothing waiting room music here.
No, we are talking about absolute brutality. The conditions were horrific. There was no modern anesthesia. There are no sterilized surgical theaters.
If you were a wounded Roman soldier, you might get a crude mixture of alcohol, maybe some opium or herbal extracts, if the medics even had them.
If they were lucky, yeah. And then the doctors just go to work. They are pulling out spearheads, setting shattered femurs, performing emergency amputations.
In the mud, in the blood, while a battle is literally still raging a few hundred yards away.
Right. And we have to ask ourselves why. Why would these ancient doctors operate in such terrible, imperfect conditions?
Yeah, why not load all the wounded onto carts, transport them 3 weeks back to Rome, put them in a clean facility, and treat them properly?
Because delay means death. By the time you get them to the sterile facility, they've bled out.
Right. The goal of the field hospital was fiercely strategic. It wasn't just a humanitarian effort. It was vital to the survival of the army.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A healed, experienced veteran soldier was infinitely more valuable than a brand new recruit who had never seen combat.
You had to keep your people alive. You had to maintain morale and stabilize them immediately to reduce the absolute chaos on the front lines.
So translate that to the spiritual reality. This is a massive paradigm shift. If the church is supposed to be this MAS unit, this trauma center, it means it is designed to function in imperfect conditions.
It absolutely is. And this is where so many modern institutions get it wrong.
In ancient warfare, a medic didn't look at a soldier who was bleeding profusely from a sword wound and say, well, you're covered in mud, you smell terrible, and your armor's a mess. Go take a bath, clean yourself up, and once you're presentable, we will admit you to the medical tent.
That sounds completely ridiculous when you say it out loud.
It is ridiculous, and it's fatal. Yet, spiritually speaking, this is exactly how many religious communities operate.
Yeah, they demand that a person clean up their act, fix their addictions, sort out their messy theology.
Defend their Sunday best, right?
Right. Before they are truly welcomed into the fold. The fatal error is treating the church like a courtroom where we judge the dirt on the soldiers, rather than treating it like a trauma center where we stop the bleeding.
Yes, but let me push back on this a little, because operating a trauma center in the mud and the blood is incredibly risky.
Oh, absolutely.
If you don't have time to form a committee or run a background check or wait for perfect clarity, you are going to make mistakes.
Definitely.
If the church is leaning into people's trauma, addiction, and chaos, doesn't that require making immediate, sometimes imperfect decisions? How do you maintain any kind of healthy boundary or order when people are metaphorically bleeding all over the floor?
You've hit on the exact tension that spiritual leaders face. I mean, ancient medical practitioners operated without full visibility. They didn't have x-rays to see exactly where the arrow was lodged. They didn't have perfectly sterilized tools.
But they had to act, because doing nothing guaranteed a casualty.
Right. In the spiritual realm, waiting for a situation to be safe, waiting for a person to be totally compliant, or waiting until you have a flawless 12-step plan means you miss the critical window for intervention.
You can't flinch. I think about what an ancient medic had to look at injuries that would make a normal person vomit or pass out. They had to look directly at the horror and keep their hands steady.
Spiritually, that means we cannot flinch when someone walks in carrying the stench of severe addiction, or the deep, erratic despair of a shattered marriage, or the ugly reality of demonic oppression. You just can't turn your face away.
You have to lean in. But here is the logistical nightmare. If the church is supposed to be this emergency spiritual triage center, how do you scale it?
That's the million-dollar question.
You cannot centralize this kind of messy, urgent care in one giant building in a city. A megachurch auditorium with stadium seating is great for a lecture, but it is a terrible place to perform emergency surgery.
Right, because if someone is bleeding out in row 42, the guy with the microphone on the stage 100 yards away has no idea. So it requires a completely borderless approach. It requires decentralization.
This is where we look at the Great Commission. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 9, verse 2, Jesus sends out his followers. And the instruction is fascinating.
What does he tell them?
He doesn't say, go build massive auditoriums and preach incredibly eloquent sermons. He sends them out to preach the kingdom of God and to heal the sick.
It's a dual mandate.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's a mandate to demonstrate the kingdom, not just lecture about it. To heal the sick, cast out demons, and restore the broken. And the analogy that perfectly encapsulates this modern application is Doctors Without Borders.
Oh, I love this parallel. When you think about the actual organization, Doctors Without Borders, what do?
They bypass the comfortable environments.
Exactly. They go into active war zones. They set up in regions hit by tsunamis or earthquakes. They go to the exact places that every sane person is trying to evacuate.
They cross geographical borders. They cross cultural and language barriers.
And most importantly for this conversation, they cross denominational boundaries.
Oh, man. It is so true.
Like if you were lying on a cot in a disaster zone, dying of a bacterial infection, and a doctor walks up to you with a syringe full of life-saving antibiotics, you're not going to ask them, excuse me, before you inject that, are you a Calvinist or an Arminian? Are you Baptist, Pentecostal, or Catholic?
You do not care. You just want the cure.
The spiritually sick do not care about our theological brands. They only care if we carry the power to stop their pain.
And this borderless, decentralized approach fundamentally changes the architecture of the church. There's a vision from 2026 detailed in this material that paints a picture of a world map shrouded in darkness.
Oh, yeah, I remember this part of the source.
Right, and then tiny little lights start popping up. Begins in Africa and then rapidly spreads across the globe. But these aren't massive floodlights of mega institutions. They are thousands of individual house churches functioning as spiritual lighthouses.
So we are moving the operation out of the theater and into the living room.
Exactly.
The blueprint here is essentially one unified church in a city, but it's made up of dozens or hundreds of house churches, and they are functioning as 24-hour prayer altars and trauma centers.
The intention behind this shift is to completely strip away the brand of Christianity. Massive stages, celebrity personalities, and corporate church empires often breed competition.
They turn believers into consumers.
Exactly. But an end-time revival, according to this framework, cannot be sustained by consumerism. It has to be forged in homes, around dining room tables, where communion is taken with reverence and intimacy. It returns the faith to a highly relational, borderless kingdom mission.
I hear that, and, part of me thinks it sounds incredibly beautiful and authentic, but let me put my skeptical hat on for a second.
Go for it.
If I'm someone looking at this from a purely organizational standpoint, isn't a house church just a tiny, chronically under-resourced version of a megachurch?
How do you mean?
Well, if I go to a large church, they have professional counselors, they have rehab programs, they have millions of dollars in resources. If I go to a living room with 6 people, what are they going to do for my severe trauma? How does getting smaller and stripping away the budget actually increase the power of the hospital?
It's a brilliant question, and it really comes down to the difference between a program and a presence. What seems small and under-resourced in the eyes of corporate management is actually incredibly potent in the realm of spiritual dynamics.
Because it's relational.
Yes. When you return to the relational model of the early church, like we see in the book of Acts, you rediscover a spiritual vitality that inevitably leaks out of large institutions.
Because in a living room, you can't hide.
Exactly. The material points out that this model requires absolute participation, not spectatorship. In a room 5,000 people, you can walk in, sit in the back, listen to the music, and walk out with your wounds completely concealed.
Yeah, no one knows your marriage is falling apart. No one knows you're battling suicidal thoughts.
But in a living room with 6 other people, sharing a meal and looking each other in the eye, the spiritual doctors can actually see where you are bleeding. There is no performance to hide behind. Authentic discipleship requires proximity.
Okay, that makes perfect sense. The proximity forces vulnerability, which allows for actual diagnosis, but that brings us to a critical problem.
What's that?
We can have these decentralized, borderless field hospitals set up in living rooms all over the globe. We can have people sitting in a circle being totally honest about their brokenness. But a hospital is completely useless without effective medicine.
That is very true.
You can have the most compassionate staff in the world, but if the medicine cabinet is empty, the patient is still going to die. We need a cure.
And that leads us to one of the most poetic and profound metaphors in spiritual history, the balm of Gilead.
The balm of Gilead. It's such an ancient phrase. Jeremiah 8.22 asks us the famous question, is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician there?
Right.
Before we talk about what it means spiritually, let's ground this. What actually was this balm in the ancient world?
Historically, Gilead was a mountainous region east of the Jordan River. It was highly renowned for its spices, its herbs, and specifically, a very rare medicinal resin.
A resin?
Yeah. This resin, sometimes referred to as the balsam of Mecca, was extracted from a specific flowering plant native to the Middle East. It was highly prized, incredibly expensive, and was used physically to soothe severe wounds, reduce inflammation, and promote healing.
So it was the ancient world's premium trauma ointment.
Exactly.
But when the prophet Jeremiah is writing about it, he's not giving a medical lecture. He is weeping. He's looking at the impending destruction of the nation of Israel by the Babylonian Empire.
The society is collapsing under the weight of its own corruption and idolatry.
Right, and Jeremiah uses this famous medicine as a metaphor, crying out, God, is there any medicine potent enough to heal the deep, self-inflicted spiritual wounds of this nation?
And Israel had a terrible habit, and this is a human habit really, of reaching for temporary balms instead of the true cure.
Yes. When they felt the pain of their separation from God or the threat of an invading army, what did they do? They didn't repent. Instead, they forged political alliances with Egypt.
They built golden calves to worship. They looked for anything that would instantly numb the anxiety.
And we do the exact same thing today. When our soul is tormented, when we feel that deep, hollow ache of rejection or lack of purpose, we reach into the world's medicine cabinet.
We grab the temporary balms, alcohol, narcotics, compulsive consumerism, toxic relationships, endless scrolling on social media, anything to mask the pain.
But there is a massive fundamental difference between a treatment and a cure.
A treatment manages the symptoms. If you have chronic pain, a treatment will lower your pain scale from a 9 to a 4 so you can get through the day. But the underlying issue remains untouched.
Right.
A cure, however, completely eradicates the source of the problem. It takes the health issue away for good. The central claim of this entire spiritual framework is that Jesus Christ is the true, ultimate balm of Gilead. He is not a symptom manager. He is the cure.
It's the difference between taking a heavy painkiller for a shattered tibia versus having a surgeon go in, reset the bone, put in the pins, and actually heal the fracture.
Yes. The painkiller just lies to your brain, telling you everything is fine while you try to walk on a broken leg, which ultimately destroys it further. Jesus, as the cure, actually resets the bone. There is also a fascinating linguistic layer to this. The word cure derives from the Latin word cura, which means care.
Care.
Historically, it referred to both physical medical recovery and spiritual pastoral care, the cure of souls. Furthermore, curing is also an ancient method of preserving food, like curing meat with salt to stop it from rotting.
Wow. So in this theological framework, Jesus curing us isn't just about fixing a past wound, it is about preserving our souls from the ongoing corruption and decay of the world around us.
To really drive home how severe this spiritual decay is and why we need such a radical cure, we have to talk about leprosy, Hansen's disease. The material leans heavily into this as the ultimate physical metaphor for spiritual affliction.
Right. Leprosy is used throughout ancient texts, specifically the Bible, as a terrifying mirror for sin and spiritual isolation. And the physical realities of Hansen's disease were horrifying.
It is a bacterial infection that spreads through droplets, attacking the skin and, crucially, the peripheral nervous system.
The nerve damage is the really insidious part. People think leprosy is a disease where your limbs just rot and fall off, but that's not exactly how it works, right?
Not exactly. The disease deadens your nerve endings so you can't feel pain.
And pain is a gift. It tells you when to pull your hand away from a fire. But a leper would reach into a fire, completely burn their hand to the bone, and feel absolutely nothing.
You would walk on a fractured foot until it was destroyed because the warning system was shut down.
Spiritually, that is terrifying. Sin numbs our spiritual nerve endings. We engage in destructive behavior, we hurt ourselves and everyone around us, and because our conscience is numbed, we don't even feel the damage we are causing.
And then there is the physical disfigurement. The bacteria causes the thickening of the skin, the collapse of the nasal cartilage, the curling of the fingers into what they call claw hands. A person's very identity, their face, becomes unrecognizable.
But as horrific as the physical reality of the disease was, the social reality might have been worse.
Absolutely. Because ancient societies did not have germ theory, they didn't fully understand how it spread. They just knew it was contagious and incurable.
So the protocol was absolute social rejection.
Lepers were completely shunned. They were exiled to live outside the city walls in leper colonies. If they walked near a healthy person, they had to cover their mouths and yell, "Unclean! Unclean!" to warn people away.
They were cut off from all human touch, from their families, from their communities. They were treated as if they were already dead.
And this sets the stage for one of the most defining moments in the life of Jesus, which completely rewrites the rules for the spiritual field hospital.
The story in Matthew chapter 8.
Yes. A man covered in advanced leprosy approaches Jesus. This man falls to his knees and says, "Lord, if you are willing, You can make me clean.
Now, by every law of the day, religious and medical, Jesus should have backed away. He should have yelled at the man to keep his distance.
But what does he do? He doesn't just speak a word of healing from 10 feet away. He reaches out his hand and he touches the man.
He touched the untouchable. Before he even healed the physical disease, Jesus cured the social and emotional disease.
Think about what that physical touch meant to a man who perhaps hadn't felt the warmth of another human hand in a decade. Jesus absorbed the man's uncleanness without being corrupted by it.
There's another instance of this in Mark chapter 3 with the man with the withered hand in the synagogue.
Yes, and many historical scholars believe this withered hand was a result of the nerve damage from leprosy.
Jesus calls the man to stand up in front of everyone right in the middle of the religious leaders who are watching like hawks to see if he would break the Sabbath rules. And Jesus heals him right there.
He didn't hide the messy, contagious reality in a back room. He confronted it publicly.
So, if we take this historical reality and apply it to our modern spiritual field hospitals, the implication is staggering. The modern church often acts terrified of the world's leprosy.
Oh, completely. We want the clean sins. We want the polite problems.
Yeah, we want someone who struggles with, worry or managing their time. We don't want the messy, chaotic, socially terrifying leprosy.
We shun the deeply broken, the severely addicted, the individuals whose lives are a chaotic mess of bad decisions and trauma.
But the mandate here is clear. Spiritual doctors must lean into the darkness. If the chief physician, Jesus, willingly touched the lepers of his day, the medical staff of his field hospital cannot refuse to treat the infected of ours.
We cannot put on spiritual hazmat suits to protect our own comfort. We have to remember that the balm of Gilead is the cure for all rejection.
Okay, that is a profound standard. Jesus is the ultimate cure, but he doesn't just snap his fingers from heaven. He chooses to distribute this cure through his people. He delegates the medical duties to the church.
Right, but realistically, the sheer volume of trauma in the world is overwhelming. One person, no matter how gifted, cannot diagnose the root cause, do the surgery, apply the balm, and provide the long-term rehab for every single person who walks through the door. It would crush them.
Which is why the blueprint explicitly divides the labor. It outlines 7 highly specific roles within the spiritual medical staff. And the very first rule of this system is critical. No single person carries all of these roles.
If you try to, you will break.
Exactly. Together, however, they form a complete, highly functioning ecosystem of healing.
I really want to dig into these 7 roles because this is a fascinating, highly practical way to look at how we are actually supposed to interact with hurting people. Let's start with role number 1, the spiritual doctor.
The core function of the spiritual doctor is discernment and diagnosis. They have a unique spiritual insight to look past the presenting symptom and identify the root issue.
Give me a scenario of how that works in real life. Let's say someone comes into the community and their presenting symptom is chronic, explosive anger. They are blowing up at their spouse. They are hostile at work. A generic approach would be to say, you have an anger problem. Here are some anger management tips. Let's pray for peace.
Right.
But a spiritual doctor sits with them, listens to the spirit behind the words, and realizes the anger is just a secondary emotion. The root issue is a profound orphan spirit caused by severe childhood abandonment.
So they diagnose the fear of abandonment.
Yes. If you only treat the anger, you're just putting a Band-Aid on a tumor. The doctor finds the tumor.
That makes so much sense. You need the correct diagnosis before you do anything else. But once the diagnosis is made, the doctor often has to move on to the next patient. That's where role number 2 comes in, the spiritual nurse.
The nurse is the absolute backbone of the long-term recovery process. Their anointing is all about care and consistency. They sustain the healing.
While a doctor might drop a heavy revelation and identify the deep wound, the nurse is the one who stays present in the aftermath.
This is deep pastoral care. It is compassion, offering daily prayer, checking in, and helping the person apply the spiritual truths in their Tuesday morning reality.
Because if you don't have the nurse, a person might experience a massive emotional breakthrough on the Sunday, but by Wednesday they are totally overwhelmed and slide right back into their old habits because they have no support system.
Right. The nurse holds their hand while they learn to walk again.
Now, role number 3 is where things get intense. The spiritual surgeon.
The surgeon. This sounds like the heavy lifting.
It is. The surgeon's domain is precision and deliverance. This involves deep inner healing and the removal of spiritual strongholds.
And a stronghold is a deeply entrenched thought pattern or belief system that is fortified by spiritual oppression.
The surgeon uses what Hebrews 4.12 calls the sword of the Spirit, the word of truth, to cut away the deception. They perform the spiritual amputations. They command the darkness to leave.
It requires immense spiritual authority and fearlessness. Without the surgeon, the spiritual infection just stays inside the wound, slowly rotting the person from the inside out.
And right alongside the surgeon is role number 4, the spiritual midwife. I've never heard this term used in this context before, but I love the psychology behind it.
It's a beautiful role. Think about what a natural midwife does. They don't create the life. They help deliver the life that is already growing inside the mother. A spiritual midwife does exactly that with a person's purpose.
They can look at someone who feels entirely useless and recognize the specific calling or destiny God has placed inside them.
And birthing something is painful. There's always massive resistance before a breakthrough. People want to quit. They feel like they aren't strong enough.
The midwife is the person standing there saying, I see the life in you. Do not give up. Push through the fear. Push through the insecurity.
Without midwives, people carry immense potential their entire lives but never bring it forth. They die spiritually pregnant.
Then we have role number 5, the balm bearer. This is the direct counterpart to the surgeon.
The balm bearer's primary function is healing and restoration. After the surgeon has come in and aggressively cut out the spiritual cancer, the patient is free, but they are also bleeding, exhausted, and incredibly vulnerable.
They feel emotionally raw.
Yes, the balm bearer steps in to apply the soothing ointment of God's presence. They minister profound peace. They speak life into a shattered identity. They sit with the wounded and essentially smear hope all over their pain.
Because without the balm bearer, people might get delivered from their demons, but they're left feeling like a gutted fish.
Exactly. Now, role number 6 is for the adrenaline junkies of the spirit, the spiritual first responder.
First responders are built for immediate intervention. These are the believers who do not freeze when chaos erupts.
When someone is in an active psychiatric or spiritual crisis, when a marriage blows up in the middle of the night, when panic takes over, the first responder steps right into the middle of the fire.
They carry an overwhelming atmosphere of authority and peace that immediately stabilizes the crisis. They don't do the long-term therapy. They just keep the person breathing until the rest of the medical staff can arrive.
And finally, role number 7, which might be the most critical for ensuring the healing actually lasts, the spiritual therapist.
The therapist focuses entirely on the renewal of the mind, anchored in Romans 12.2.
You can have the surgeon cut out the root issue and the balm bearer soothe the wound, but the brain has spent years building neural pathways around that trauma.
The therapist works to rewire those thought patterns. They help the patient identify the subtle lies they still believe and systematically replace them with truth.
Because without the therapist, a healed person will eventually use their old toxic thought patterns to recreate the exact same bondage they were just delivered from.
I am utterly fascinated by the dynamic tension between the surgeon and the balm bearer here because, let's be honest, we all probably lean naturally toward one or the other.
Oh, for sure.
Some people hate confrontation, so they just want to be balm bearers, offering endless hugs and comfort. Other people, and I'm thinking of a few folks I know right now, fancy themselves as surgeons.
Right.
They love dropping hard truths. They love walking into a room, pointing out everyone's sins, swinging the sword of truth, and cutting through the nonsense. But how does a surgeon ensure they are actually performing life-saving surgery and not just committing spiritual butchery?
That is one of the most vital distinctions in this entire blueprint.
Mm-hmm.
If you only use the sword, if your entire ministry is just rebuking people, confronting sin, and dropping heavy truth without immense love, people are going to feel judged, cut up, and abused.
You might technically be speaking the truth, but you are leaving them bleeding out on the operating table. Truth without love is just brutality.
But on the flip side, if you are only a balm bearer,
if you only offer comfort, validation, and safe spaces, but you completely refuse to confront the self-destructive behavior or the hidden sin the underlying cancer remains,
you are making the patient comfortable while they die. Jesus modeled the absolute perfect balance. When he dealt with the woman caught in adultery, he used the balm to protect her from the religious leaders who wanted to stone her. He offered her total grace.
But then he used the surgeon's scalpel when he looked at her and said, "Go and sin no more." He cut out the behavior while validating the person.
You have to have both. The surgeon cuts, the balm bearer soothes, the therapist rehabs. It is an incredible interdependent system.
But there's a massive flashing red warning light in this material. Before anyone is allowed to put on these spiritual scrubs, before you are allowed to pick up a scalpel or a jar of balm, you have to become the patient.
You have to go under the knife yourself.
Yes. The text is unambiguous about this. The great physician operates on his doctors first. God does not recruit from the unprocessed. You cannot bypass your own healing process to go try and heal others.
The classic analogy here is the airplane safety briefing. In the event of a sudden loss of cabin pressure, secure your own oxygen mask before assisting others.
It sounds selfish at first, but it's pure logic. If you are hyperventilating and you pass out from hypoxia while trying to help the person next to you, you become a second casualty.
But in the spiritual realm, the stakes are even higher. It's not just about catching your breath, it's about fundamentally rewiring what drives you. The material calls this process heart surgery, drawing from the prophetic book of Ezekiel, chapter 36, verse 26.
Where God promises to remove the heart of stone and replace it with a heart of flesh.
Exactly. And a heart of stone is essentially a trauma response, isn't it?
Yeah, when people are hurt, rejected, or abused, they build walls. Their heart becomes calcified to protect against further pain. A stony heart is defensive, cynical, and self-preserving.
But you cannot be a spiritual doctor with a heart of stone, because a stone cannot feel compassion. The surgery involves God breaking down those walls and giving you a heart of flesh.
And the terrifying thing about flesh is that it is soft, it is vulnerable, it can be bruised, but it is the only type of heart that can actually pump life to the rest of the body.
But dealing with a stony heart means confronting all the ugly stuff we hide inside. Hidden motives, deep-seated bitterness against people who wronged us, our own pride, our desperate need for validation.
If you try to bypass this heart surgery, the consequences are disastrous. The material analyzes the severe danger of ministering out of a wounded heart.
If your heart is still bleeding from unresolved trauma, you will inevitably minister out of your pain, not your purity.
You'll bleed on the patient.
Exactly. You will react to people rather than discerning their needs. If someone triggers your unresolved rejection issues, you will lash out at them under the guise of righteous correction.
You end up wounding the very people you're assigned to heal because your own pain is clouding your judgment.
So how do you know the difference? How does someone know if they're ministering out of an open wound versus ministering out of a healed scar? Because obviously our past pain is part of our testimony.
Well, a wound is highly sensitive to the touch. It is actively infected. If you touch a wound, the person screams.
If someone brings up a past failure or betrayal, and you are instantly filled with rage, anxiety, or a desperate need to defend yourself, that is an open wound. You are not ready to operate.
A scar, however, is a memorial of where the wound used to be. The tissue is healed. It might remind you of the pain. It might give you profound empathy for someone going through the exact same thing, but it is no longer bleeding.
A healed scar allows you to say, I survived this and I can show you the way out, without making the interaction about yourself.
The material also brings up a very intense requirement for personal healing: spiritual amputations.
It references Jesus' words in Matthew 18. If your hand or foot causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away.
That sounds incredibly extreme, especially in the context of a hospital meant for healing.
It is extreme, but in the context of ancient triage, it makes perfect sense. Amputation was the absolute last resort to save a life when a limb was consumed by gangrene.
Right, if you left the rotting limb attached, the infection would enter the bloodstream and kill the entire body.
Spiritually, this is about radical boundary setting. If there is a habit, a toxic relationship, an addiction, or a secret idol in your life that is constantly poisoning your spirit, you cannot just manage it.
You cannot just put a bandage over gangrene. You have to radically sever it from your life.
You cannot function as a life-saving spiritual doctor if you are actively harboring a lethal, contagious infection.
And even after the surgery and the amputations, the process isn't over. You have to go through the mind renewal phase.
Romans 12.2 calls us to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. This addresses the phenomenon where the physical or spiritual surgery is completely successful, but the patient continues to live as if they are still sick.
Like phantom limb syndrome, or an elephant that stays tied to a tiny plastic chair because it was trained with heavy chains as a baby. The physical chain is gone, but the mental chain remains.
Precisely. The heart can be healed, but the neural pathways of fear, inadequacy, and poverty mentality are still deeply grooved into the brain.
You have to actively retrain your brain to think in alignment with your new healed reality. Otherwise, you will self-sabotage and rebuild the prison you just escaped from.
Okay, so the doctor goes through the heart surgery, amputates the toxic habits, and renews their mind. Now they're ready for the field hospital.
But here is the practical reality of working in a trauma center. The burnout rate is astronomical. If you are constantly dealing with demonic strongholds, deep grief, and chaotic crises, how do you sustain this?
How does the medical staff keep going?
The material points to a foundational teaching of Jesus in John 15, abiding in the vine. Jesus says, I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing.
The secret to avoiding burnout is realizing that the branch does not produce the fruit by straining, sweating, or agonizing. The branch produces fruit simply by maintaining a clear, unobstructed connection to the life source of the vine.
So burnout happens when a spiritual doctor disconnects from the intimacy of God and starts trying to heal people using their own natural empathy, their own intellect, and their own limited energy reserves.
Yes. When you rely on your own strength, ministry shifts from being a supernatural outflow to a massive performance. You might have an incredible set of natural gifts. Maybe you are highly charismatic, extremely articulate, or naturally empathetic.
You can coast on those gifts for a while.
But gifts without the sustained character and life source of the vine will eventually collapse under the weight of the warfare.
When a minister operates on fumes, they ultimately cause immense harm to their congregation and experience catastrophic burnout themselves.
That is a terrifying but necessary reality check.
Okay, let's look at the ultimate objective of this field hospital. Because you don't just patch up a wounded soldier so they can sit alone in a tent for the rest of their life. The goal isn't just a collection of physically healthy, isolated individuals. The goal is to fix the entire ecosystem.
This brings us to the profound calling of being ministers of reconciliation. The text makes a compelling argument that physical or emotional healing is not the finish line. The actual end goal of the kingdom is restoration and reconciliation.
Let's look at 2 Corinthians 5:18. It says, all this is from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation.
The material breaks this down into a three-dimensional assignment. First, the vertical dimension, reconciling people to God. This is the core of the gospel message, bridging the gap caused by sin.
Second, the horizontal dimension, reconciling people to one another, healing the divisions, the racial divides, the broken marriages, the fractured friendships.
And third, holistic internal reconciliation. Reconciling a person to their own true identity, bringing all the fragmented pieces of their soul into divine order.
But the horizontal part, reconciling people to each other, is incredibly difficult because human beings love to hold on to grudges. The material speaks heavily about the cost of unresolved offense.
If someone hurts you deeply, the natural response is to build a wall of bitterness. But what does that actually cost you spiritually?
The cost is devastating. Holding on to offense guarantees spiritual stagnation. It creates isolation. The text even notes that it blocks your prayer life.
Think of it this way. Holding on to an offense is like demanding that a deep wound remain open. You refuse to let it heal. And in fact, you pick at the scab and reopen it every single day, all while wondering why you are bleeding to death.
You think your bitterness is punishing the person who hurt you, but it is actually destroying you.
So overcoming offense requires the active application of peace. But the material uses a very specific active definition of peace, shalom.
In Matthew 5:9, Jesus says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. And here is where we need to highlight one of the most critical distinctions in this entire blueprint, the difference between a peacekeeper and a peacemaker.
The difference is night and day. A peacekeeper is driven by the fear of conflict. Their goal is simply to maintain quiet. They will sweep toxic behavior under the rug, ignore abuse, and placate angry people just to avoid a fight.
But that isn't true peace. That is just a ceasefire over a landmine. The avoidance just breeds deep, hidden tension that eventually explodes.
A peacemaker, on the other hand, actually creates peace where it does not exist. And creating peace often requires stepping directly into conflict.
Peacemakers address issues directly. They bring the hidden darkness into the light. They speak hard truths, but they do it in love.
True biblical shalom is not the absence of conflict. It is the presence of righteousness, wholeness, and divine order. Look at Jesus. He constantly confronted the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. He flipped the tables of the corrupt money changers in the temple.
He initiated intense conflict to restore divine order, yet he remained the absolute Prince of Peace.
I'm going to play devil's advocate here, because this is where a lot of people get hurt in religious environments. When someone hears the word reconciliation or peacemaker, their trauma response kicks in.
They think, the church is telling me I have to go back and be best friends with my abuser. I have to be a doormat. I have to just forgive and forget and put myself back in danger because I'm supposed to make peace.
But the material is very clear that reconciliation does not mean abandoning boundaries. In fact, true peacemaking requires wisdom and truth. So practically, how does a peacemaker enforce a boundary without destroying the peace?
A peacemaker enforces a boundary by standing immovably firm in divine order. You do not bring peace to an abusive situation by surrendering to the abuse. You bring peace by enforcing the standard of light over the darkness.
Sometimes true peacemaking means saying, I forgive you, but you no longer have access to my life because your behavior is destructive.
The material argues that when a spiritual doctor releases God's peace publicly into a chaotic situation, it literally shifts the atmosphere of the room. You aren't forcing in a natural, dangerous unity. You are mediating God's standard of wholeness.
You never compromise truth to achieve a fake peace.
And that reality, the fact that enforcing peace often requires confronting darkness, leads us to one of the most surprising and frankly badass elements of this entire framework. To be a healer in this field hospital, you cannot be a pacifist. You have to be a fighter.
Yes. We arrive at the dual identity of the spiritual doctor-warrior. The fundamental premise here is that the kingdom of God is always advancing into violently contested territory. The brokenness in people's lives is not just neutral bad luck.
The wounds, the addictions, the despair, these are heavily guarded by spiritual resistance.
The material uses the prophetic picture of Nehemiah to illustrate this, and it is my absolute favorite visual in the entire text.
Let's set the scene. Nehemiah is trying to rebuild the ruined walls of Jerusalem, but he is surrounded by hostile enemies Sanballat, Tobiah, who are constantly mocking him, threatening his life, and plotting to attack the city while it's still vulnerable.
They want Jerusalem to remain in ruins. So how does Nehemiah orchestrate this massive construction project under active threat?
He issues a brilliant command to his workers. He tells them to build the wall with a trowel in one hand while holding a sword in the other.
Half the men stand guard with spears, while the other half builds. It is the perfect illustration of what a spiritual doctor is called to do. You are attempting to rebuild the shattered walls of someone's life, but the enemy who destroyed them in the first place is actively trying to stop you.
If you put down your trowel and just hold your sword with both hands, you might win the fight, but the wall never gets built. The person never gets healed.
Precisely. But if you put down your sword to focus entirely on the building process, ignoring the spiritual threat around you, the enemy simply walks in and destroys everything you just accomplished. You have to be able to build and battle simultaneously.
It's the exact definition of a combat medic. If you are treating a wounded soldier in a firefight, you can't just casually wrap a bandage around their leg while taking heavy enemy fire.
You have to lay down suppressive fire with your rifle while you use your other hand to tie the tourniquet.
The theological backing for this is Ephesians 6.12. The text reminds us that we do not wrestle against flesh and blood. The angry spouse, the rebellious child, the hostile coworker, they are not the actual enemy.
The battle is against spiritual principalities, oppressive powers, lies, and demonic strongholds that are manipulating those individuals.
A mature spiritual doctor-warrior has the discernment to know exactly what they are dealing with. They can look at a situation and decipher what is purely natural psychological trauma that needs gentle therapy and what is a demonic stronghold that needs to be violently expelled.
If someone is actively being oppressed by a demonic lie, you can't just give them a hug and a cup of tea. You have to fight the lie.
Which is why the material lays out a very specific operational order for complete ministry. Remove, restore, rebuild, and reinforce.
Walk me through those 4 steps.
First, remove. This is the warfare aspect. Deliverance ministry removes what should not be there, the demonic influence, the lies, the spiritual oppression.
Second, restore. This is the healing aspect. You apply the balm to restore the emotional and spiritual tissue that was damaged by the enemy's presence.
Third, rebuild. You begin to rebuild the person's true identity, showing them who God created them to be.
And finally, reinforce. This is the mind renewal phase we discussed earlier, reinforcing the walls so the enemy cannot regain entry.
If you skip the remove phase and only focus on restore, you are leaving the enemy inside the camp. If you only focus on remove and forget to rebuild, you leave the person empty and vulnerable. It requires the entire sequence.
Okay, so the combat medic is laying down suppressive fire, wrapping the wound, and rebuilding the wall. But what exactly is the enemy trying to destroy in the first place?
What is the ultimate objective of all this warfare? Why does the darkness care so much about keeping people broken? The text states very clearly that the ultimate prize in this war is the believer's identity.
This is where every single concept we've discussed converges, the blueprint for restored identity.
The author posits a fundamental truth. Without a restored, crystal-clear identity, a believer is incredibly vulnerable to manipulation.
They wander through life without purpose, they easily believe the lies the culture tells them about their worth, and most importantly, their spiritual authority is completely neutralized.
The enemy doesn't just want to make you sad, he wants to make you forget who you are, because if you don't know who you are no threat to his kingdom.
To illustrate how God completely reboots a hijacked identity, the text provides 5 specific biblical case studies. Let's dive deep into these because they represent almost every flavor of human failure and trauma. First, Moses.
Moses' original identity was fractured by a combination of profound privilege, sudden failure, and total rejection. He grew up as a prince of Egypt, tried to be a deliverer in his own strength, ended up murdering an Egyptian, and had to flee for his life into the desert.
For 40 years, his identity was fugitive, failure, and forgotten shepherd. But God meets him at the burning bush. God doesn't just give him a task, he restores his identity.
He tells Moses who he is, God's chosen deliverer. Moses had to accept his restored identity before he could walk into Pharaoh's throne room with any authority.
Second case study, Peter. This one is so visceral.
Peter was utterly bruised by his own spectacular failure. He swore he would die for Jesus, and hours later denied he even knew him 3 times to a servant girl.
When the rooster crowed, Peter's identity as a loyal, courageous disciple was shattered. He went back to his old life of fishing. But look at how Jesus restores him in John 21. Jesus meets him on the beach, cooks him breakfast, and asks him 3 times, "Peter, do you love me?"
Jesus is systematically overwriting the neural pathways of the 3 denials with 3 affirmations of love. It's brilliant psychological and spiritual restoration.
Exactly. And with each affirmation, Jesus gives him a command, "Feed my sheep." Jesus wasn't just making Peter feel better. He was completely reinstating Peter's identity as the foundational shepherd of the early church.
That restored identity is what gave Peter the audacity to stand up on the day of Pentecost and preach to thousands of people.
Third, Job, the ultimate story of loss.
Job was stripped of every single external marker that society uses to define identity. He lost his massive wealth, his social standing, his health, and tragically, his children.
His own friends sat around him for days, insisting that his identity must be secret sinner for God to punish him this way.
But Job refused to accept that false identity. Through his intense, terrifying encounter with God in the whirlwind, Job's understanding of his true identity, that he was righteous and intimately known by the Creator, regardless of his external circumstances, was fundamentally restored.
He defeated the lie that his suffering meant God had abandoned him.
4th case study, the Apostle Paul.
Paul is the ultimate example of a radical identity shift. His entire sense of self, his pride, and his religious zeal were built on being the chief persecutor of the early Christians.
When Jesus blinds him on the road to Damascus, he completely dismantles the identity of Saul the Pharisee and builds the identity of Paul the Apostle to the Gentiles.
Once that new identity was locked in, it unlocked a level of spiritual authority that literally changed the course of human history.
And finally, the 5th case study, Zacchaeus.
Zacchaeus was crushed under the weight of intense public shame and social isolation. As a chief tax collector working for Rome, he was viewed as a traitor to his own people. His identity was corrupt, thief, and outcast.
But when Jesus passes through Jericho, he stops, looks up into the tree, and calls him by name. "Zacchaeus, come down. I must stay at your house today."
That one simple public act of relational acceptance completely shattered the identity of shame. It restored Zacchaeus' sense of worth so rapidly that he immediately repented, gave half his wealth to the poor, and paid back anyone he had cheated 4 times over.
The restoration of his identity produced instant behavioral wholeness. So what we are seeing here is that restoring someone's identity is not just giving them a superficial pep talk.
It's not looking at a broken person and saying, "Hey, chin up, you're a good person, believe in yourself." It is a complete authoritative system reboot.
It is looking them in the eye and reminding them of their royal rank, their divine assignment, and their unimaginable worth in this borderless kingdom.
And the material culminates this entire framework with one final, massive theological connection. He looks back at the Old Testament, specifically the book of Leviticus. Now, Leviticus is notoriously difficult.
It's the graveyard of every Read the Bible in a Year plan. It is nothing but incredibly dense, ancient purity laws and animal sacrifices. How does it possibly connect to modern identity restoration?
The author points to two specific chapters, Leviticus 14, which details the intricate ritual for cleansing a leper who has been healed, and Leviticus 8, which details the consecration of the high priests.
In both of these seemingly unrelated ceremonies, the priests had to follow a very specific, unchanging prophetic blueprint. They had to apply the blood of a sacrifice to the right earlobe, the right thumb, and the right big toe of the person.
And then, and only then, could they apply the holy anointing oil over the exact same spots.
Blood first, then oil. The order is non-negotiable.
Exactly. In biblical typology, the blood always represents sacrifice, the forgiveness of sin, and deliverance. It is the cleansing agent.
The oil represents the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, healing, power, and divine calling. The profound revelation here is that this is God's eternal blueprint for restoring identity. The blood must prepare the way for the oil.
Explain the why behind that. Why can't you just pour the oil first?
Because if you pour the oil of power, calling, and spiritual gifting onto an uncleansed, unhealed person, you are simply empowering their dysfunction. You give a wounded, bitter person spiritual authority, and they will use it to destroy people.
The blood, the deep repentance, the heart surgery, the deliverance from strongholds must cleanse the slate first. Once the slate is clean, the oil of the Holy Spirit empowers the new identity.
The blood removes the chains of the past. The oil fuels the destiny of the future.
That is an absolute aha moment. Identity is the engine of spiritual authority. When God applies the blood and the oil, when he fully restores who you are, it completely neutralizes the enemy's power over your life.
A person who knows they are deeply loved, fully cleansed, and specifically called, can no longer be manipulated by fear or shame. They transition from being a patient bleeding on a cot to becoming a fully equipped, fully healed spiritual doctor, ready to pick up their own scalpel and jar of balm and deploy right back out into the field hospital.
It is a breathtaking, comprehensive blueprint. It completely dismantles any excuse for passivity. It demands that we abandon our comfortable religious spectatorship and engage actively, fearlessly, and borderlessly with a world that is in desperate need of triage.
We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We started by walking into the messy, chaotic, urgent triage of the spiritual field hospital, realizing once and for all that the church is not built for the perfect, it is built for the bleeding.
We explored the highly specific, interdependent roles of the medical staff, understanding that we need both the surgeon's sharp sword of truth and the balm bearer's soothing hope.
We confronted the absolute, non-negotiable necessity of submitting to our own painful heart surgery before we dare to operate on anyone else's trauma. And we embraced the dual high-stakes calling to be both an uncompromising peacemaker and a fierce combat medic, fighting with everything we have for the ultimate prize, restored identity.
The challenge now is moving from theory to practice. The blueprint is laid out. The question is whether we are willing to operate in the mud and the blood to see it fulfilled.
Which brings me to a final thought for you, our listener, to mull over long after this audio stops. The next time you walk into a room, maybe it's your office, maybe it's a family gathering, maybe it's your own living room, and the air is thick with tension, division, unspoken trauma, or obvious hurt, I want you to ask yourself a question.
Are you walking into that room merely as a spectator, hoping that someone else, some professional, will eventually show up and fix the mess?
Or are you stepping into that chaos as a fully authorized, thoroughly healed spiritual first responder? Are you walking in carrying the life-saving balm of Gilead in one hand and the sharp sword of truth in the other? The world is broken, the field hospital is open, and your shift has just begun.
Well said.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.